Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I wanted to talk tonight about Parshat Chayei. This year is dedicated in honor of my dear mother, whose birthday it is tonight, or was today. Mazal Tov, and her English one's tonight. It's amazing how that worked out. That's nice. You should live to 120, and may your children bring you lots of nachas. I want to talk tonight about the opening scene of the Parsha. Seemingly something quite out of the ordinary and really unusual. The first, 18 and 20 verses of the Parsha deal with Avram's purchase of a gravesite for Sarah. The purchase of the Ma'arat Hamachpela, that cave that we go pray by, and it talks about all the technical details. And it's really a little bit strange. Why do you have to get into these nitty-gritty details? It sounds almost like a husband and wife discussing their shopping trip, right? He was going to give it to me for free, and then I offered him like this, and then I said like that, right? Like all the details of the transaction. Why is that relevant? Of all the things the Torah records, it's very, very selective. And here it has to tell us about the purchase of this particular gravesite. So obviously there's something significant about the purchase itself, and certainly about the place which was purchased. Just to bring out how sensational this place is, I want to talk about a story. Fast forward a few hundred years, in the 1640s, there was a rabbi whose name was Avraham Azulay, and I'm not a fan of crazy wacky stories that don't have much evidence. This particular story is recorded by the Chida, the grandson of this rabbi, and he is not a sensationalist. He is very top heavy, right? He wrote about 50-something books, a serious responsa. He was a serious force in halacha to be reckoned with, extremely intellectual person. Okay, and he records the following story about his grandfather, Rabbi Avraham Azulay. Avraham Azulay lived in Chevron in Israel in the 1640s, and the following story took place one day. The leader of the Turkish Empire, the Sultan, came passing through town that day, to check on the different lands, and he went to this holy site, which is holy for lots of people. Abraham is buried there, Isaac. It's holy for many different religions. And he went to go visit the cave where our forefathers are buried. And if you've ever been there before, the structure that's there now was not always there, but a very prominent feature is once you're actually in the actual place, there's a big hole in the ground, which apparently leads down into the actual cave where everyone is buried. So the Sultan was curious, and he leaned over to take a look, down there, and his sword slips out of its case and falls down into the cave. Okay, it falls down deep into the cave of Ma'arat Hamachpela. He hears the clinking sound, and it's down there. He doesn't give up so easily. He's an important man. So he says to his soldiers that are with him, "Go get me my sword." "Yes, sir. Yes, your honor." They tie a rope to one soldier, and they slowly lower him down into the cave. And within moments, they hear him shrieking, screaming, and then they pull him up, and he was dead. They tried it again with one or two other soldiers, and they saw that it was hopeless. Anytime they lowered a human down there, he would die within moments. Something quite remarkable. So what did they decide? He didn't want to give up on his sword. So they said to him, "Sultan, why don't you just get a Jew to go down there? If he succeeds, fantastic. And if not, who cares?" So they said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." So they approach the Jews of Chevron, and they say, "You must send forth one of your people to go down into the cave and retrieve the Sultan's sword. And if you don't do it, you're all going to be very, seriously punished." So the whole town is in an uproar. They decree a day of fasting and praying. This is all recorded in the Chida. They fasted and they prayed. And finally, the leader of the town, the head rabbi, Rabbi Avraham Azulay, he wrote a book called the Chesed LaAvraham, a tremendous work. He says, I'll go down to the cave. Just pray for me. He spent another day fasting and praying. He prayed to Hashem, and that in the merit of his forefathers that are buried there, he should be protected and come out safely. Sure enough, the day comes. They tie a rope around Rabbi Avraham Azulay, he had dressed himself in tachrichin, burial shrouds, in white, as if he's going to be buried. And they tie the rope around him, this tremendously holy person, and they lower him down into the cave. And he describes what he saw. He says, when I got down there, I saw 3 figures with beards. And they said to me, we are Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And he said, I was so taken aback, I was so moved by the intensity of the Kedusha, of the holiness, that I said to them, I don't want to go back, I want to stay here with you. And they responded to me, he says, that you can't stay here because it's going to get the whole town in trouble if you don't get back there with the sword. So go up, but we promise you, 1 week from now, you'll be back here with us. So he takes the Sultan's sword and he goes back up. They were all of the Sultan and his soldiers were stunned by this sight. The Jew coming back up after so many had tried and failed. He gives them the sword. He tells everyone the story, and sure enough, 1 week later, he passed away and was buried there in the neighborhood. Not in the cave, but he was buried in the neighborhood. Okay, this has become a famous story and really, really unbelievable. We're dealing with something that's really high voltage, really high frequency. This is and like I said, there are lots of wacky stories out there, but this one was recorded by reliable sources. Unbelievable. What's going on? What is it about the Ma'arat Hamachpela? What are we dealing with? What is this place? So let's get started. Right in the beginning of our parsha. Why did Avraham want this cave? He comes, his wife Sarah passes away upon hearing the news of the almost death of her dear son Yitzchak. She dies of the shock. So now he has to come to bury her. And he wants specifically the cave of Machpelah. And the Midrash reveals to us why. The Midrash says that in last week's parsha, that's when he had his heart on our cave. For quite some time now. Why? He had the 3 guests come over. You're familiar, right? The 3 gentlemen who he was waiting outside in the hot sun to greet guests. It was so hot that none were around. So God sent 3 angels in the form of men to be his guests. And he's running around doing things for them. Let me get you some water. Come wash your feet. And then it says over there, Ve'el habakar ratz Avraham. Avraham ran to the cattle. He went to go prepare a nice calf for each one of the angels. Right? There were 3 guests, and he wanted to make sure that they all get the best pick of the meat. So he slaughtered 3 different calves to feed them. He served them each a tongue to show like this was for you. So he's chasing after the finest of the flock. The Midrash relates that the fattest and most beautiful cow started running away. And it ran, and Avraham said, that's the best one. I need to go get it. And he chased and chased after this cow until finally he ended up in Ma'arat Hamachpela, in the cave, which he's now trying to acquire. And he says when he got there, he saw a candle lit, and he saw that Adam, the first man, and his wife Chava were buried in that cave. And he said he smelled the scent of Gan Eden. He realized this was an incredibly spiritual place, an incredibly holy place. And he said, I need to be buried here, and I want my family to be buried here. And from that moment, he had his heart set on it. I want to show you something incredible. The Hebrew word for bakar, the cattle, Ela bakar ratz Avraham. Avraham chased after the cattle. I want to show you what that is in Hebrew. I'm going to open up a whiteboard. I hope this works. You see this whiteboard in front of you? Yeah? Okay. So take a look at this. The Hebrew word for cattle is El ha-bakar. That means cattle. The Midrash says that you should rearrange the letters to find out the underlying meaning of the verse. If you switch around these two letters, it will make the word El Ha-Kever. Excuse me, I just wrote it in script instead of regular writing. El Ha-Kever. To the grave, Avraham ran. He ran and ran after that cattle, and he traced it all the way back to the kever, to the grave, that ultimate gravesite in which he wanted himself and his wife to be buried. Now let me show you something else that's fantastic. We said that those guests that he was welcoming to his home were actually angels, right? One of them was an angel that was sent to heal him. One was to tell him that he was going to have a son, and one had come to destroy the city of Sodom. One of the angels that was coming to heal him was Raphael. Raphael is the angel of healing that God uses to send to heal people. And if you rearrange these letters, Raphael means that God should heal. The Zohar points out that you could rearrange the letters of his name to spell Par-Kel. I'm not going to finish the other word. Par-Kel, which means the bull or the calf of God. That means that the calf that Abraham chased after, which led him to Ma'arat Hamachpela, was in fact the angel Raphael, had taken the form of this thing from his flock and led him all the way to the grave where Adam Harishon was buried, the Ma'arat Hamachpela. Meaning this was divinely ordained. God set it up that Abraham should find this place. Right? They talk about the details and the many levels of the Torah. Right? We just entered a level called Remez, where the very letters of the Torah rearranged can tell you the whole story without saying anything. Right? Ela Bakaratz Abraham, he ran to the grave, and it was Raphael, the Par-El, who led him to that grave. Abraham had to find this place, and that's where he wanted to bury his children. Now, what is it? We haven't described why it's so special. We know that it's special, right? So Chazal actually reveal there's a collection of Tanaic sources called Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar, the great Tana Rabbi Elazar. It's one of the Midrashim, and he relates that Adam, when he had to set up a gravesite for himself, he said, listen, in the future there is going to be the two tablets that God gives us. And those tablets were carved just with the finger of God. And they were so holy that when the Jewish people entered Israel, they only had to place the ark into the Yarden, into the Jordan River, and the whole thing, the waters parted, and the Jews were able to cross, just because of the tablets. And in future generations, those tablets had to be hidden so that people shouldn't worship them. So he said those were tablets that were just carved with the finger of God. I, man, was made by the hands of God. I was made by God's hands. People are going to worship me. I have to find a place to hide myself so that I should not turn into idolatry after my death, that people shouldn't worship my body. So what he did was he started searching around and around for a place to be buried until suddenly he smelled the scent of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which he was banished from. And all of his days, him and his wife Chava were just yearning to get back to. He smelled that scent and he started digging and digging and digging. And he realized that he was about to get to the entrance of Gan Eden, the entrance into that spiritual world that's in our world a little bit, but not in our world, until a voice came out from heaven and said, stop digging. You're not allowed to go any further. He said, fine, but this is where I want to be buried, right here at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And that, of course, is the cave of the Machpelah. The Ma'arat Hamachpela is the cave that Adam had dug for himself, initially to hide himself away from people so he shouldn't become idolatry, and also because it's the closest that he can get to the Garden of Eden. Okay, so this is an important piece in our puzzle to understand what is the cave of Machpelah, what is Ma'arat Hamachpela. It's somehow it's the entryway, whatever that means, to the Garden of Eden. One of the many paths and entrance and gates that we have in this world is the Garden of Eden. Okay, so that's just one piece of the puzzle I want to put on the table. If I could leave you hanging for a moment, let's step back from this story and let's get to the story in the beginning of our parsha. Avram is negotiating with a man named Ephron to acquire this cave. And Ephron, Chazal are very critical of him Because if you actually read the lines of the Chumash carefully, you'll realize what a swindler and what a cheater this guy is. He says to him, the Torah emphasizes, he says, in the eyes of all of the people, says to Avraham, you're like a prince amongst us. I don't want you to pay any money for the cave. I'll give it to you for free. In front of everybody over here, I'll give it to you for free. Chazal point out, why did he emphasize as in front of everyone? Because he was saying, listen, I can't charge you for it. Everyone's watching. And I don't want to be looking, I don't want people to see me like that kind of guy. So I'll offer it to you for free. But you should know, in my heart of hearts, I really want top dollar for this thing. Avraham says, I get the idea. No favors. No, I'll pay you for it, says Avraham. I'll pay you. You don't have to give it to me for free, sir. I'll pay you for the cave. So Ephron responds, pay me what? Come on, 400 silver shekel? What? Come on, between me and you and I, 400 shekel? No big deal. 400 silver shekel, which is the amount that Avraham ends up paying, is an exorbitant amount of money. Later on, we learn that Yaakov buys land for himself, his wife, all of his livestock, and his children. Right? He buys a nice piece of property, and he pays 25 silver shekel. 25 silver shekel. Avraham is now paying 400 silver shekel. Just to give you an idea of the relationship between these two numbers. He was able to buy property for his entire family. That's Yaakov, the whole estate. Avraham is buying a little cave at the edge of a field, and he's paying 400 silver shekel. The equivalent, let's say, like $1 million for a little shack. Absolutely crazy. Chazal say about Ephron, he's the polar opposite of Avraham Avinu. Ephron talks a lot. I promise you, I'll give it to you for free. And in the end, he doesn't give anything. Not even a drop he gave for free. He charged him 400 silver shekel, an astronomical fee. Chazal say this is the opposite of Avraham. They contrast these two men. In the beginning of last week's parsha, Avraham invites his guests, and what does he say to them? Come, I'll give you a little bit of water. Let's wash your feet. I'll give you a little bit of water. Me'at mayim, he says. I'll give you a little water. What does he end up giving them? Bread and butter, and each one gets an entire calf for himself. Chazal say that's the way a person should be. Say a little bit. I promise you, I'll give you a little bit of water. And when you end up giving, you give a lot. I'll give each one of you an entire cow. Yeah. Say a little and do a lot. That's Avraham Avinu. Ephron, the person he's negotiating with, says a lot and does nothing. So I think it's quite interesting. The one place we find this contrast is right here. In the negotiation of the field, it's exactly the spot where we find the contrast between Avraham and Ephron. Isn't that curious? Right? It happened to be the two people that are involved in this purchase, and they have the exact opposite quality. Avraham says a little bit, and he produces tremendous amounts. Ephron says a lot, and there's actually nothing behind his words. Zero. Right? A real politician. Isn't it interesting that it's right here by the purchase of the cave? It's something that we have to pay attention to, right? The placement of this contrast also is an indicator of something that's going on beneath the surface. I was thinking to say that really here, this is expressing the same idea that we saw with Adam. Adam saw that this was the gateway to Gan Eden. This little physical cave, you can't plant in it, you can't, you're not going to have any crops in here. It's actually the entryway to the most spiritually packed place in the planet. Gan Eden is this thing that straddles between this world and the next world. And this is the most spiritually packed place. And the entryway is through Ma'arat Hamachpela. On the outside, it seems like the lowest place of the field. Rashi goes into detail in the beginning of our parsha explaining that this was the poorest quality land in the whole area. And that cave was the worst. You couldn't plant anything, completely unfertile. So on the outside, it looks very little. But on the inside, in the depth of it, if you go down deep into that cave, you'll find the most spiritually potent place in the universe. Isn't that exactly this idea? On the outside, you express very little. I say a lot, Omer me'at, take a little bit of water. But if you dig a little deeper, oseh harbe, you have a whole cow for each one of them. The outward expression is very, very limited. And beneath the surface, you have an entire universe that you could never even imagine. It's exactly here where that's expressed. And you see the change of ownership taking place is unbelievable. Between Ephron, who is the exact opposite of Avraham, who's selling him now something which is worth so much on the inside, but on the outside it's not actually so valuable. The Shem Shmuel points out that anytime you have something holy in this world, it's always going to be surrounded by what he calls chitzonim, external forces, evil forces on the outside that try to distract you and deter you from this holiness. I lived in the old city for 2 years. I should tell it's one of the strangest places on the planet. There's so much contention over there. So everything's on the edge. It's the holiest place in the universe, right? The place of the Beit HaMikdash. And what a mess. On the outside, it's surrounded by a mess. Constant fighting and pressure between different political forces. It's a big mess over there, right? That's exactly this idea. You have a holy, holy center. So the more holy it is, on the outside, you're going to have more peels and things that are blocking from that holy core. So here it is, one of the most precious places in Israel, the Ma'arat Hamachpela, the cave. And on the outside, it's surrounded by filth, all the most mundane and evil forces. It's in the ownership of Ephron. Think about the symbolism of that, right? Abraham had to come and break off these shells that are covering this pure core of Ma'arat Hamachpela. That's every time. Anytime you try to do something holy in this world, you want to do a mitzvah. I'm going to start going to shul. I'm going to start going to class. Suddenly, you get a phone call a few minutes before the class. Suddenly, like an interesting thing comes up. Maybe I won't go to shul. Suddenly, you feel, you go to sleep late the night before, so you can't make it to the shul in the morning. Anytime you try to do anything holy, there's always going to be a little bit of pushback. And that's this concept right here. Take a look at the guy, Ephron. His name is Ephron. His name means afar, dirt. Right? He's the complete contrast to the life that lives inside of that cave. So now, let's go a little bit deeper now. Ma'arat Hamachpela. We learned that it's the entrance to Gan Eden. It's something that on the outside looks very little, but on the inside is a tremendous amount. The word Machpela means doubled. Kaful. Everything's doubled. So what's doubled about it? So first of all, you have a lot of couples in it. You have Adam and Chava are buried there. You have Avraham and Sarah are buried there. Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, they're all buried. So you have a lot of couples. So in that sense, it's like doubled. You have a lot of doubles over there. The physical makeup of the cave also, the Gemara describes it as a room within a room. You have like a room on the outside, and then there's another room when you go inside. And it's also 2 levels. There's one level and then another level beneath it. So it's everything about it is doubled, right? The way people are buried there, the physical makeup of it is doubled. So what's that about? The Zohar writes that the word Machpela is Ha-Machpela. What's doubled about it is the Hey. Hey Machpela. There are 2 Heys in Hashem's name. One representing the upper world and one representing our physical world. Yud, and then a Hey, and then you have the letter Vav, and then another Hey. Those 2 Heys are Ha-Machpela, are this place of Ma'arat Hamachpela. And now we can understand why. It is the transition, it is the pathway into the next world. The Gemara says when people pass away, they're neshamot, they travel through Ma'arat Hamachpela. They first go to Hebron, and then they go to the next world. When a person prays, his prayers, as we know, they go to the temple in Yerushalayim, and another place they pass through, conceptually, is Ma'arat Hamachpela. They have to pass through the cave where our forefathers are buried. So what we know about the cave is that it's a transition, it's a transfer station. When things leave this world and go into another world, you need to have some sort of interface between the 2 worlds. They're complete opposites, right? Our world is physical. The next world is completely spiritual. You can't just transition from one to the next in a snap. It's too sudden, right? When the sun comes up in the morning, it's gradual. It doesn't just boom, lights on. That would blind us. You can't handle such a transition. All transitions have to be gradual, right? Even the transition we're experiencing now, from summertime to winter, you have to have the fall in between, where slowly the leaves change color, then they fall off. You always have this in-between period of transition. That in-between period of transition is the Ma'arat Hamachpela. It's doubled. It sits between this world and the next world. It's that interface between the two realities. It's the gate between this world and Gan Eden. It's the place where our prayers pass through from our physical world to the spiritual world, where the neshamot go back into the spiritual world. It's that doubled place. That is the core of what Ma'arat Hamachpela is. It is the place where both worlds exist simultaneously. Our world and the spiritual world. That's what I'm trying to bring out over here. And the people buried there are the people who lived that way their whole life. The ones who merited to be in Ma'arat Hamachpela are the people who lived a double life. And when we say the word double life in our area, sometimes in the colloquially that can mean, you're like an imposter. On the outside you live one life, and then you live another life on the side. Just the opposite. Just the opposite. On the outside you're living one life, and at the same time, simultaneously, you're aware that everything that you're doing in this world is actually reflected in another world above. So when I take a quarter and put the coin into a poor person's hand, I realize that it's more than just giving 25 cents to a poor person. I realize that some incredible spiritual thing has just happened. Everything that I do in this physical world, I realize I'm connected to a chain that leads to the spiritual world. A person who lives with that consciousness is living in two worlds. The Gemara says that there are three people who experienced the next world while they were still alive. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Those three people who were buried in the Ma'arat Hamachpela. And their wives. That's always one and the same. And their wives. Because they're able to live with this consciousness constantly. That's what it means. Now we can understand a midrash. There's this very strange midrash. It says, we say at Eshet Chayei on Friday night, Zamema Sadeva Tikachehu. You're familiar with those words? Zamema Sadeva Tikachehu. Yeah, that song we sing Friday night. It's talking about the Jewish woman, and it says how she conspired to buy a field, and she acquired it. She wanted the sadeh, the field, Vatikachehu, and she got it. The Midrash says that this refers to Sarah Imenu. Sarah wanted the cave of Machpelah, and she acquired it. We see in our parsha, before it's acquired, she's already dead. What does it mean that she acquired the field? The Midrash says her whole life, all she wanted was Ma'arat Hamachpela, and then she got it. The answer is that her whole life, she was working towards Ma'arat Hamachpela. She was living in the mode of Ma'arat Hamachpela, a double life. When she realized that when she made challah for Shabbat, it wasn't just she could fill family's belly. She realized that she was involved in a spiritual endeavor. I'm bringing honor to the Shabbat. I'm feeding my family so they'll have energy for the week and to do Hashem's mitzvahs. That's living a double life when the physical world takes on a spiritual significance. And that's why everything around Sarah was miraculous. Like we know when Isaac brings Rivka into his tent, he says, oh, you're just like my mother. Look, 3 things just came back. Suddenly there's a blessing in the dough where it's more abundant and more fresh than regular dough. Suddenly the candle lasts from week to week, from one part of the week to the end of the week. And there's a cloud, like a divine cloud that hovers over the tent. These are the 3 qualities that Sarah made possible. There was a blessing in the dough that it would go way further than you would imagine, more than meets the eye. There was a candle that was constantly lit beyond what's able to be lit. And there's a divine cloud above the tent. All those 3 things are the next world protruding into this world, the spiritual world protruding into our world. right? Naturally, the dough should get rotten and it should be only a certain amount, but there's a blessing in the dough. It becomes spiritual. Naturally, the candle should be extinguished, but there's a blessing in the candle and suddenly it lights for longer than it ought to. And there's a cloud hovering over the tent where, as if the heaven is trying to squeeze into Sarah's tent. Right? That is the most powerful imagery of the life that Sarah lived. Vayu Chayei Sarah. She pushed Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh together. She lived in the cave of Machpelah her entire life. That's what it means. Her whole life, she was living with this reality that I'm just in a gate, or I'm in the transition zone between this world and the next. Now, what does that mean for us? We are not going to be buried in Ma'arat Hamachpela. There's no more space over there. They ran out of space, no occupancy. So what good is that for us? Great. There were these spiritual people that lived once, and they were able to live at like the interface of reality and keep everything connected, this world and the next world, like really unbelievable. But what does that have to do with us? So I think the story from 1640 really lays it out clearly. Avraham Azulay, that man we opened with in the beginning, the rabbi who went down to get the Sultan's sword. How come he was suddenly able to survive that experience when all the soldiers before him died? The answer was he was able to tap into that mode of living. Avraham Azulay was a tremendous, huge person. He realized that this physical world is not all that there is, obviously. He constantly was living with a next world kind of brain. Yes, and therefore, when they lowered him down in there, he was not shocked by what he saw. He was able to see this double world existing. Whereas those soldiers, those foolish soldiers, right, who volunteered the life of a Jew, they were living only in this world. They did not appreciate the depth that lies behind every physical, and therefore they couldn't handle the spiritual energy. The moment they were lowered into the cave, poof, they were banged out of existence. They can't handle that kind of spiritual energy. Which means the good news for us is that the connection has already been made. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rachel, Rivka, Leah, our forefathers and our matriarchs, they already did the hard work of connecting the cables. They made this link between our world and the spiritual world. For them, it was tremendous work. Avram had to intuit everything from Ariel. He had to figure out what tefillin are, and he had to figure out the spiritual impact it has, and create them and tie them on his arm. We don't have the work to do that from scratch, but in their merit, we received our Torah, and the Torah is this link that they created between this world and the next world. It allows us to infuse everything that we do with tremendous spiritual energy. So the connection's already there. Like for example, right, to make a phone call overseas would be a tremendously difficult thing. You'd have to like run the cable all the way across the ocean to get to the other land, right? And the first time you made a phone call, it actually took a very long time, right? First they had to lay out the cable, and then you can make the phone call. But it's already been done now, so we can constantly make the phone call, right? Our forefathers already laid out the cables. They already made the connections, and now we just have to utilize that framework which they set up for us already. So this is our rich heritage. This is the significance of Ma'arat Hamachpela. That's why Avraham had to haggle so much, and it was so important to him to take it out of the hands of Ephron, who said a lot and did nothing, which is the exact opposite. You say a little, you do a lot, meaning there's a whole world underlying everything in this physical world, right? Say a little, you do a lot. That's the whole world, right? The whole world is just a little bit, and then beneath it, there's a lot. There's a whole spiritual world lying beneath it. That's the connection. That's the significance of Ma'arat Hamachpela. That is why Avraham coveted so much. That's why they all merited to be buried there. And that's our heritage. We live in the footsteps of our forefathers and our matriarchs who already laid out this connection for us. And now we can utilize it as easy as can be. And the most prominent place we have to exercise this muscle is on Shabbat, the time when we light the candles and eat the challah. Right? Shabbat is that next world protruding into our world every single week. Right? If you utilize that properly, then we finally transition into the next world after 120. It won't be a shock to us. It will be like Avraham Azulay. He says, "Hey, you're the forefathers. Like let me hang out with you," and they'll say, "Welcome." right? If we utilize those opportunities we have in this world, then when we finally do make that transition, it won't be a surprise to us because we'll constantly be straddling those two worlds. And that is the idea I wanted to share with you tonight, and I hope that you gained from it. Anybody has any questions? I will be happy to take them. You just have to unmute yourselves. Okay, and if not, I bid you a good evening.